All right. So for my oral book review, I did The Age of Oil by Leonardo McCary. Overall, the book was really interesting. Um, just to give you a bit of background, the book was split into three parts. So the first 15 chapters were um, just talking about the history of the oil, history of the oil industry, um, starting in like the mid 1800s, and in the late 1890s, just talking about John D. Rockefeller and his creation of an American oil monopoly. And then chapters 15 through 19, they were mainly just referencing the start of the environmental questions that came with our reliance of crude oil. So just talking about like in the early 70s, the counterculture that began and people started asking more and more questions. And then chapters 19 through 22 is kind of just Leonardo's perspective and what all came with that. So, yeah, I guess the summary of the book would just be, this is basically just teaching you the ins and outs of the worldwide oil industry. So, just talking all about the conflicts that occurred in the mid 80s and 70s, also regarding oil in the Middle East and the wars that ensued. Talked about the effect of the USSR collapse on the oil industry because Russia has a lot of oil and they had very close relationships with a lot of these Arab states. So just talked about, the history from like basically, it even went back to oil use and oil derivatives used in Mesopotamia, all the way up until like 2004, 2005. So, it was overall really interesting. Sadly, I didn't feel like it was from a very environmental perspective. That kind of became clear to me as I started reading, which is too bad, but definitely an interesting book. It makes me think made me think a lot more about the everyday uses of oil and how much we truly rely on it. So that was good. I think, like I said, it became pretty obvious early on that the book wasn't, in fact, very environmentally focused. But I think the main objective of the book was to teach you about the ins and outs of the oil industry and the overall history of how it built up to what it is today. So I think if that was his objective, then it definitely was accomplished. Just a lot of information that I didn't know before, so that's always a fun part of reading. I think, like I mentioned before, the theme in the book was not really talking about the negatives of oil, but more talking about all the good that oil had created and all the benefits from using oil all the time. So, I think from an environmental perspective, the book is not a good example. But the theme became obvious that Leonardo, being a former Italian oil executive himself, was definitely biased and didn't really talk about the downfalls of it, more just talked about the possibilities and all that it had created through like the 50s to the 90s, basically. So, and then I think the audience for the book could be anyone that was intrigued about the oil industry, because he does go into such detail and detail that I never would have thought about. He also has a lot of inside information and insight because, like I said, he himself was a oil executive for large Italian companies. So I definitely thought that was interesting. Yeah. And like I said, he opened my eyes to a lot of new information. Sadly, I was kind of hoping the book would talk more about the downfalls of our reliance on oil and like the effect that it's gonna have on the future. He didn't necessarily talk about that much, but that's okay. You can kind of see why an oil executive wouldn't want to just continuously badmouth the oil industry, considering it gave him a lot of what he had. Yeah. So I would say overall, the book taught me a lot. If you're looking for an environmental perspective, I would not recommend it. I'd recommend it to anyone who's interested, but if you're looking into the negative effects and the environmental toll that oil takes, this is not the book for you. So the book was really interesting. A lot of really interesting information and all that goes into the oil industry, but I would not recommend it for an environmentally conscious reader, or just,